The smell hit me first, a bitter, metallic tang layered over the acrid ghost of something burnt, something that had been alive and then wasn't. I stepped over the threshold into what remained of Dr. Aris Thorne's bioengineering lab, the air thick with an oppressive silence that belied the chaos. Yellow tape crisscrossed the entrance, a flimsy barrier against the enormity of the destruction within. "Read. Glad you could make it." The lead detective, a man whose patience wore thin even on routine cases, gestured vaguely into the wreckage. "Looks like a bad day at the office for Thorne. System overload, maybe? Or a miscalculation." He shrugged, his eyes already searching for the easiest path out. My gaze swept past him, dismissing the glib assessment. This wasn't a mere bad day. This was an implosion of a life, a carefully constructed world shattered. The lab, once a gleaming testament to cutting-edge research, was now a mangled sculpture of twisted metal and scorched polymers. Yet, despite the widespread devastation, an eerie precision marked the scene. The blast hadn't ripped the outer walls, instead, it had buckled inward, containing its fury. It was as if a destructive force had been unleashed and then immediately stifled, leaving behind a core of intense, localized damage. I moved deeper, my boots crunching on shards of reinforced glass. Heat-warped benches sagged under the weight of partially melted equipment. A complex holographic display unit lay on its side, its screen spiderwebbed with cracks, a phantom glow still flickering from within its ruined circuitry. This was Thorne's sanctuary, his crucible for world-changing ideas. Now, it was his tomb. He was working on something big, the lead detective continued, trailing me. Proprietary, of course. High security clearance just to breathe the same air as his research. Corporate is already circling like vultures, trying to figure out what's salvageable. I knelt beside a workstation, running a gloved finger over a residue clinging to a ceramic surface. It was a fine, almost crystalline powder, a vibrant cerulean that seemed out of place amidst the ash and soot. Thorne's research involved complex organic compounds, not mineral pigments. I made a mental note, pulling a sterile swab from my kit. "And Thorne?" I asked, my voice low. "Over there." The lead detective pointed towards the central chamber, a reinforced containment unit that had suffered the brunt of the internal explosion. Thorne's body lay slumped against a console, partially obscured by fallen debris. Even from a distance, I could discern the telltale signs of severe thermal trauma. His lab coat, usually pristine, was fused to his skin in places, the fabric brittle and blackened. The air around him still hummed with a faint, electrical charge. Preliminary suggests an accidental discharge of whatever he was synthesizing, the scene commander, a stoic woman with tired eyes, interjected. Pressure buildup, containment breach. Or, given his reclusive nature and the pressure he was under, a deliberate act. I approached the body, my gaze methodical, dissecting the scene piece by piece. Thorne's left hand was splayed on the console, fingers curled inward as if grasping at something that wasn't there. A scorch mark, precise and circular, marred the metal surface directly beneath his palm. It was too clean, too perfect, for a random blast pattern. It looked almost etched. And the color of the metal within the circle was subtly different, a faint, almost iridescent blue. Another note. No signs of forced entry, the lead detective said, consulting a tablet. All security protocols were intact. Access logs show only Thorne entered the facility in the last 24 hours. Which reinforces the accident or suicide theory, the scene commander added, her tone resigned. A tragic loss of a brilliant mind. I nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of their immediate conclusions. My own mind, however, was already diverging. The cerulean residue, the precise scorch mark, the contained nature of the explosion, these were discordant notes in an otherwise straightforward narrative of tragedy. The process of documentation and removal was swift, efficient. Thorne's body was carefully secured for transport, destined for a more thorough examination. I followed the gurney out, my eyes still scanning the periphery, searching for anything else that whispered of anomaly. Thorne lay on the stainless steel table, his features obscured by the sheet, the evidence of his violent end now contained, awaiting my deeper scrutiny. My gloves snapped into place. I began my methodical examination, starting with his hands. That splayed left hand, the one that had rested on the console. I carefully photographed it, then leaned closer, adjusting the magnification on my inspection lamp. There, just beneath his index finger, on the epidermal ridge, was a minute discoloration. It was microscopic, barely visible to the naked eye, a faint ghost of a stain that seemed to shimmer under the focused light. I touched it with a sterile swab. The substance transferred, leaving a faint, emerald streak on the white cotton. It was unlike anything I'd seen in the lab, certainly not a component of Thorne's known research. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't suicide. This was a signature, deliberately placed, meticulously hidden. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to stage this scene, to make a murder look like a scientific mishap. And they had underestimated my eye. The game had just begun. The air in the trauma center cold room awaiting examination hung heavy, not just with the chill, but with the scent of disinfectant and something metallic sweet, an undertone of decay that chill couldn't entirely suppress. I stood over the gurney, the sheet pulled back, revealing Aris Thorne. He looked smaller here, stripped of the lab coat and the aura of genius. His skin, a mottled gray, contrasted sharply with the precise, almost surgical scorch marks that marred his torso and arms. Preliminary findings: the medical examiner, a gaunt individual with perpetually tired eyes, stated, gesturing with a gloved hand. The external trauma suggests a high-energy thermal event. Flash burns, primarily. But the internal picture. That's where it gets interesting. I leaned closer, my gaze sweeping over Thorne's chest. The burns were superficial in places, deep and necrotic in others, creating an uneven tapestry of damage. My mind replayed the scene in the lab, the contained explosion, the intact walls, the specific scorch on the workbench. Fractures to the sternum and several ribs, the examiner continued, tapping a translucent image on a tablet. Indicative of blunt force trauma, surprisingly localized given the external thermal damage. And the lungs. Significant barotrauma. But here's the kicker: no widespread soot inhalation, no signs of a prolonged fire. It was acute, violent, and fast. My eyes narrowed. So, a pressure wave, but not an inferno. Exactly. And the thermal damage, while severe, isn't consistent with prolonged exposure to extreme heat. It's more like a directed energy burst. Almost as if the heat was applied selectively. I ran a gloved finger along a particularly precise burn line on Thorne's forearm, tracing the edge of what looked like a perfect circle, about 2 centimeters in diameter. It was too clean, too deliberate for a random explosion. My earlier observation of the cerulean residue from the lab clicked into place. Did you find any foreign substances on the skin, other than the expected biological matter? I asked, my voice low. The examiner consulted his notes. Minute traces of a cerulean-colored particulate, consistent with the samples you collected from the lab. It was embedded in some of the deeper burns. We're still analyzing its composition. High melting point, highly reactive, certainly not something you'd find in a typical lab accident. And the hands? I prompted, my attention drawn to Thorne's right palm. Clean, relatively speaking. No defensive wounds. Suggests he didn't struggle, or the event was too rapid for him to react. I took Thorne's hand, turning it gently. The fingers were slightly curled. I examined the fingernails, then the creases of the palm. It wasn't the cerulean residue. This was different. With a pair of fine tweezers, I carefully extracted the microscopic shard. It was iridescent, no larger than a grain of sand, shimmering with an unnatural, almost metallic luster. Not glass, not metal, not plastic as I knew it. It possessed a peculiar, almost organic sheen, but clearly synthetic. It was the color of a beetle's wing, shifting from deep emerald to sapphire blue depending on the angle of the light. Nothing I'd ever seen in a research lab, especially not Thorne's, which was meticulously kept. This wasn't from the explosion. This was on him. This, I murmured, holding the tweezers aloft for the examiner to see, was not part of the accident. The examiner peered at it through a loupe. Remarkable. We didn't spot that. Too small. What is it? That's what I intend to find out, I replied, carefully placing the fragment into a sterile sample bag. It was a unique, non-lab-related trace element, a discordant note that sang louder than all the official reports. Thorne hadn't just died in an accident, he had been touched by something alien to his world just before his end. Later that afternoon, the sterile chill of the cold room replaced by the hushed, corporate hum of the research facility's administrative wing, I sat across from the rival scientist. Dr. Silas Vance, a man whose tailored suit seemed perpetually a size too tight, exuded an air of barely contained exasperation. His office was minimalist, almost aggressively so, a stark contrast to Thorne's cluttered genius. Thorne was intense, Vance began, his voice tight, his gaze flicking to the framed accolades on his wall. Driven. Brilliant, yes. But also fiercely competitive, and exceptionally secretive. Especially with this last project of his. Did this competitiveness ever lead to conflict? I asked, watching his hands, which gripped the edge of his polished desk. Vance scoffed, a short, sharp sound. Conflict? Thorne considered collaboration a weakness. He saw every other researcher as a competitor. We were both vying for the lead on the Convergence Initiative, a major funding grant. My team had a breakthrough last quarter, a significant step forward in biomimetic material synthesis. Thorne, well, he seemed to think he could just leapfrog us with some radical new approach. He was always pushing boundaries, often recklessly. Recklessly enough to cause an explosion? Vance leaned back, a sneer playing on his lips. It wouldn't surprise me. The man played with fire, metaphorically speaking. And he certainly didn't share his methodologies. He was convinced he was on the verge of something world-changing. Something that would make all our work obsolete. The resentment in his voice was palpable, a thick current beneath the polite veneer. A clear motive. My next stop was a small, cluttered apartment off campus, far from the gleaming corporate towers. Maya, a former research assistant to Thorne, answered the door, her eyes red-rimmed, but her posture stiff with defiance. The aroma of stale coffee and something faintly metallic lingered in the air. He was a monster, she stated, without preamble, her voice raw. A genius, yes, but a monster. He took my ideas, my data, and claimed them as his own. Said I was just an extension of his will. When I confronted him, he fired me. Said I lacked the necessary vision. When was this? I inquired, making a note. 3 months ago. Right after I presented him with a viable prototype for a bioluminescent sensor. He dismissed it as trivial, then suddenly, a month later, it was part of his project proposal for the Convergence Initiative. I had proof, of course. But he had the power, the connections. She wrung her hands. I lost everything. My academic future, my reputation. Did you ever try to reclaim your work? Her eyes flashed, a spark of anger cutting through her grief. What was I supposed to do? Break into his lab? Thorne had security tighter than Fort Knox. No, I just watched him. Watched him take credit for what was mine. I hoped he'd fail. I hoped his arrogance would catch up to him. I noted the bitter edge in her voice, the deep-seated injustice. Another motive, equally potent as Vance's professional jealousy. Two individuals, both with plausible reasons to resent Thorne, to wish him ill, perhaps even to stop him. Yet neither seemed the type to orchestrate a precise, contained explosion with exotic materials, let alone leave a unique, iridescent fiber on his person. The pieces were still scattered, refusing to form a coherent picture. The accident narrative was crumbling, replaced by a far more intricate, deliberate act. And the true nature of Thorne's final project, whatever it was, felt like the missing key. The stale air of the interview room still clung to my clothes as I stepped out, the colleagues' words about Thorne's ambition echoing. Ambition, jealousy, injustice, a potent cocktail of human failings. That required something more. My next stop was the facility where Thorne's physical remains awaited. The journey was a blur of city lights giving way to the stark, utilitarian architecture of the complex. Inside, the chill hit me first, a dry, penetrating cold that spoke of preservation. I found the forensic technician already at work, a quiet, methodical figure in scrubs, hunched over a stainless steel table. "Read," the technician acknowledged without looking up, his voice a low hum. "Anything new?" I asked, approaching the table. He gestured with a gloved hand towards the form beneath the sheet. "Just started the external. Still early." I nodded, stepping closer. The sheet was pulled back, revealing Dr. Thorne. The burns were extensive, a testament to the sheer force of the event, but what caught my eye immediately were the margins. They weren't uniform, not like a simple flash fire. There were areas of deeper penetration, almost localized, and then others where the skin was merely seared. It suggested a directional force, perhaps multiple points of origin, or a very specific type of accelerant. I leaned in, examining the extremities. His hands, though damaged, seemed to have taken the brunt of the initial blast, as if he'd been reaching, or shielding. There was a faint discoloration beneath the nails, a residue that the technician was carefully swabbing. "Anything on this?" I murmured, pointing. "Too early to tell." "Could be anything from the lab debris," the technician replied, his focus unwavering. I pulled back, a familiar knot tightening in my gut. Thorne's eyes were still open, fixed on an unseen point, reflecting nothing. Suicide seemed less and less plausible. A man preparing to end his life rarely reaches out, rarely displays such specific, localized trauma. This wasn't a desperate act, it felt like a target. My focus shifted from the physical remains to the digital ghost of Thorne's work. I needed access to his research, his files, anything that could shed light on what he was working on, and more importantly, what could have been worth killing for. The lead cyber forensics officer, a young woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind, sat surrounded by monitors displaying cascades of data. "We're in," she announced, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Thorne's primary server. It's a fortress, but we cracked the outer shell." "What about his project files?" I asked, pulling up a chair. "Specifically, anything related to advanced genetic sequencing. Global health, bioweaponry, anything with dual-use potential." She typed for a moment, then a complex directory structure bloomed on her screen. He had several secure partitions. "This one, Project Chimera, looks like the main research repository." She clicked, and a progress bar appeared. "It's massive. Encrypted with a proprietary algorithm, but we're decrypting it now." As the files loaded, I scanned the metadata. The timestamps were critical. Most of the files showed continuous updates until the night of the incident. But then, a flicker caught my attention. A cluster of files deep within the Chimera project, dated just hours before Thorne's death, showed signs of unusual activity. "Stop there," I instructed, pointing to a specific folder. "Look at these access logs. And the checksums." The cyber officer zoomed in. "Ha! That's odd. There are multiple entries for file modifications, then deletions, then partial restores, all within a 10-minute window." She frowned, her brow furrowing. "And the user ID for these actions? It's Thorne's, but the IP address is internal, yet not from his usual workstation." "Someone was trying to manipulate the data," I stated, the pieces beginning to click. "Or delete it. And they used Thorne's credentials, but from an unfamiliar terminal. An attempted wipe." "More than an attempt, Reed," he corrected, his voice tight with professional indignation. "It's a sophisticated data manipulation. Someone had accessed Thorne's critical research, tampered with it, and then tried to cover their tracks, just hours before his death. This wasn't an accident. This was calculated." Later, I found Maya, Thorne's assistant, in a quiet corner of the temporary administrative office. He was pale, clutching a mug of untouched tea, her gaze distant. "Maya," I began, my voice soft. "I need to ask you about Dr. Thorne's recent behavior. Did you notice anything unusual?" She flinched slightly, her eyes darting to the door before settling on me, filled with a fragile fear. "He He was different. Lately. More withdrawn. He kept saying they were watching him. Paranoid, I thought. But he was so convinced. Did he ever specify who they were? I pressed gently. She shook her head, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. No. Just. They. He'd lock himself in the lab for days, sometimes. And he started keeping a second set of backups hidden. Said he didn't trust the main server anymore. A second set of backups. Data manipulation. And they had succeeded, almost. But a ghost in the machine, a digital echo, remained. I had to find it. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile, unforgiving glow on the stainless steel surfaces and the shrouded forms resting on gurneys. It wasn't the kind of place I usually spent much time, but the microscopic trace I'd found, a nearly invisible speck on Thorne's lab coat, had brought me here, to a specialized analysis unit tucked away in the facility's lower levels. My breath plumed faintly in front of me as I hunched over the spectral analyzer, its interface glowing a cool blue. All I had to do was run the advanced sequence. I adjusted the focus, the tiny fleck shimmering into view on the monitor, a speck of something utterly alien to the organic detritus usually found at a scene. My fingers moved over the console, precise and deliberate. The machine word, a soft, high-pitched whine that intensified as the laser scanned the material, breaking it down to its elemental composition. Lines began to dance across the screen, a jagged landscape of peaks and valleys. Each spike represented a specific element, a unique fingerprint. Most of them were common enough: carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, the building blocks of everything. But then, a series of sharp, distinct peaks emerged, clustering together in an unfamiliar pattern. I zoomed in, cross-referencing the signature against an extensive database of synthetic materials. My brow furrowed. Nothing matched immediately. I expanded the search parameters, digging deeper into categories of highly specialized compounds. The database churned, millions of entries sifting through the unique spectral signature. The minutes stretched, punctuated only by the hum of the machine and the distant thrum of the facility's ventilation system. Then, a match. Not a perfect one, but close enough to trigger a flag. I pulled up the information. It was a synthetic polymer. Incredibly rare, known for its extreme durability and heat resistance. Its composition included elements not typically found in consumer products or even standard industrial applications. This wasn't some random contaminant from the street or a stray fiber from a piece of clothing. The database listed its primary use: high-end industrial tooling and aerospace components, often in proprietary systems where material failure was not an option. My gaze drifted from the screen, past the silent, covered forms in the cold room, and settled on the wall. Thorne hadn't been working with aerospace components. He'd been working with biological systems. This polymer, however, was a tell. It spoke of precision, of extreme engineering, and of significant investment. It spoke of a world far removed from a lone bioengineer's lab, no matter how advanced. "Well, that changes things," I murmured, more to myself than to the technician, who merely offered a slight nod, his attention already drifting to another task. The initial theory of a lab accident, or even a suicide, crumbled further. This trace wasn't from Thorne's lab equipment. I knew his inventory. This was external. Someone had brought it in, or something made of it. And the list of entities capable of manufacturing or acquiring such a specialized polymer was short. Very short. At the top of that list, funding Thorne's groundbreaking research, was Omnicorp. Omnicorp. A global conglomerate with fingers in everything from pharmaceuticals to heavy manufacturing, and a notoriously aggressive R&D division. They had been the primary financial backer for Thorne's project, pouring millions into his work. The official story was philanthropy, an investment in scientific advancement. My gut told me it was always about control, about intellectual property. I spent the next few hours cross-referencing Omnicorp's publicly available patents and material science reports. It was a long shot, but I needed something more concrete. Deep in their archived patents for advanced manufacturing processes, I found it, a mention of a proprietary synthetic polymer, developed for extreme environment applications. The chemical structure outlined in the patent was a near-perfect match for the spectral signature I just identified. This wasn't just a random connection, it was a direct link. The killer hadn't just tried to erase Thorne's work, they had left a calling card, albeit one only visible under extreme magnification. And it pointed straight to the heart of the corporate beast. I arranged a meeting with the Omnicorp liaison assigned to Thorne's project, a man named Mr. Albright. The appointment was set for later that afternoon at Omnicorp's local administrative office. He agreed with almost unsettling alacrity, too quickly, I thought, for someone about to be questioned regarding a murder investigation. The Omnicorp building was a monolithic structure of glass and steel, glinting under the afternoon sun. Inside, it was all polished marble and hushed efficiency. The receptionist, impeccably dressed, directed me to a minimalist conference room. Albright arrived precisely on time, a man in his late 40s with a meticulously tailored suit and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He extended a hand, his grip firm, almost practiced. "Investigator Reed," he began, his voice smooth, "thank you for coming. We're, of course, deeply saddened by Dr. Thorne's passing. A tragic loss for science, and for Omnicorp." I took a seat opposite him at the long, gleaming table. "Mr. Albright, I appreciate your cooperation. I have a few questions regarding Omnicorp's involvement with Dr. Thorne's research." "Anything at all," he said, leaning forward slightly, an eager-to-please posture that felt entirely too rehearsed. "We're an open book. Dr. Thorne was a brilliant mind, and we were proud to support his endeavors. Our funding was purely in the spirit of advancing human knowledge, you understand." "I understand the stated purpose," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "I'm interested in the practical aspects. Omnicorp provided not just funding, but also, I believe, some specialized materials for Dr. Thorne's lab?" Albright's smile wavered for a fraction of a second, a barely perceptible tremor. "Materials? Well, yes, some standard lab consumables, I suppose. Nothing out of the ordinary. We have a robust supply chain." "I'm referring to something more specific," I pressed, watching his eyes. "A proprietary synthetic polymer. Used in high-end industrial applications. A material Omnicorp has patented." He blinked, a carefully controlled reaction. "Ah, yes, that polymer. Our Vanguard series. Remarkable stuff, incredibly durable. But I don't recall us supplying any of that to Dr. Thorne. His work was biological, not mechanical. Why would he need it?" He paused, then added, unless, of course, he requested it for some experimental apparatus? But I'm not aware of any such request. He sounded genuinely perplexed, almost offended by the suggestion. You're certain? I asked. Because a microscopic trace of that exact polymer was found at the scene. On Dr. Thorne's person, to be precise. Albright's composure cracked, just a little. His jaw tightened. He cleared his throat. On his person? That's highly unusual. I can assure you, investigator, Omnicorp has stringent protocols regarding the distribution of proprietary materials. It simply wouldn't have left our facilities without proper authorization and documentation. And as I said, there's no record of Dr. Thorne requesting it. He gestured vaguely with a manicured hand. Perhaps it was a contaminant? From a visitor, perhaps? Or even some external source entirely unrelated to Omnicorp? Or, I countered, my voice low, someone from Omnicorp brought it to him. Or brought something made of it. He leaned back, his gaze hardening slightly, though the polite smile remained fixed. That's a rather serious accusation, investigator. Omnicorp values its reputation. We would never compromise the integrity of a research partner, especially one as esteemed as Dr. Thorne. I'm not making an accusation, Mr. I'm following evidence, I clarified. And the evidence points to a material that is unique to your corporation. I need access to your distribution logs for this Vanguard polymer for the last 6 months. And a list of all Omnicorp personnel who had direct access to Dr. Such information is highly sensitive, of course. Proprietary. But for the sake of Dr. Thorne's memory, we'll endeavor to assist. He paused, then added, you understand, this is a very large corporation. Tracking every gram of every material, every visitor. It takes time. Time is something Dr. Albright's evasiveness, his overly cooperative initial stance, the sudden defensiveness when confronted with the specific evidence, it all painted a clearer picture. The ghost in the machine wasn't just data, it was a physical trace. And it had led me directly into the intricate, dangerous web of Omnicorp. The killer was closer than I thought, hidden behind layers of corporate secrecy and polished smiles. And I had just peeled back the first layer. Albright's carefully constructed evasiveness still clung to me like a fine dust, even hours later. The corporate executive's performance had been too polished, his initial helpfulness a thin veneer over a deeper resistance. He hadn't just been protecting corporate interests, he'd been protecting something specific, something that resonated with the microscopic polymer trace I'd found. The ghost of it, the why, continued to gnaw. My focus returned to the polymer itself. Its molecular structure was unique, a complex weave of synthetic strands and rare earth elements that pointed to a highly specialized application, or perhaps, a bespoke creation. I spent the rest of the afternoon hunched over my bench, cross-referencing databases, a cold cup of coffee forgotten beside my elbow. Thorne's lab, for instance. I was closing in, the grid of potential sources narrowing with each eliminated lead. The late afternoon sun had bled into a bruised purple twilight by the time I packed my bag. My determination, usually a quiet hum, now vibrated with a sharp edge. I felt the pull of a connection, an invisible thread tightening between Albright's guarded words and the polymer's silent testimony. Stepping out into the city's rush, the usual cacophony of horns and engines felt amplified. I navigated the pedestrian traffic with practiced ease, my mind still replaying molecular patterns. I was halfway across the street, the crosswalk signal flashing its final countdown, when the heavy roar of an engine swelled unnaturally close. A black utility vehicle, oversized and anonymous, shot through the intersection, ignoring the blaring horn of a taxi and the frantic shouts of other pedestrians. It swerved, not wildly, but with a calculated precision that brought its massive grille within inches of my left hip. The sheer force of its passage buffeted me, spinning me half a turn. My breath hitched. It wasn't just a reckless driver, the vehicle hadn't been speeding erratically. It had been moving with purpose, a direct line towards my path, only veering at the absolute last second. I watched its taillights disappear into the stream of traffic, a cold knot forming in my stomach. A near miss, easily dismissed as urban chaos. But my instincts, honed by years of deciphering anomalies, screamed otherwise. This felt intentional. The incident put a sharp edge on the rest of my evening. It was an unwelcome intrusion, a professional paranoia bleeding into my personal space. The next morning, the unease lingered. I walked into my personal lab, the sterile scent of reagents and clean surfaces usually a comfort. But something was off. The small, meticulously organized space felt subtly disturbed. My microscope, always positioned precisely at the center of its mat, was a fraction of an inch to the left. A faint, almost imperceptible scent, a metallic tang I couldn't immediately identify, hung in the air, masked by the usual laboratory odors. I ran my hand along the edge of my workbench. A microscopic layer of dust, usually undisturbed, showed the faint smear of a palm print, wiped almost clean, but not quite. Only I knew how long it took for dust to settle in here, how often I cleaned. This wasn't a random cleaning service. This wasn't an accident. Someone had been in my lab, after hours, and had taken pains to erase their presence. Someone wanted to send a message. Someone wanted me to stop looking. It was Maya, Thorne's colleague, her name flashing on the screen. I hesitated, then answered. "Reed? I need to talk to you. I heard about almost getting hit yesterday. They was that. Was it real?" Her question, delivered with such raw anxiety, confirmed my suspicions about the vehicle incident. It hadn't just been a fleeting moment of bad luck. It was real enough, Maya. "What's wrong?" I kept my voice steady, projecting calm I didn't entirely feel. I can't do this anymore. I'm scared, Reed. After what happened to Thorne. And now you. She took a shaky breath. I saw something. Before it all happened. I didn't think anything of it at the time, not really. Just thought it was Thorne working late, or early. I moved to my office, closing the door behind me. "What did you see?" "Someone. Not Thorne. In his lab. After hours. A few times, actually, in the weeks leading up to the accident. Always late, like after midnight. I just happened to be finishing up a separate project in the adjacent wing, saw the lights on, the door ajar sometimes. I just assumed. But it wasn't him. Taller, I think. And they were quick. Like they didn't want to be seen. I never saw their face. Never saw them leave, either. Just. The lights would be on, then off again an hour later. Her words hit me like a physical blow, connecting the disparate threads. An unknown individual, accessing Thorne's high-security lab after hours, weeks before his death. The polymer, the staged accident, Albright's evasiveness, my own accidents, it all began to click into place, forming a far more sinister pattern. This wasn't a lab accident, not suicide, not even a simple murder. Maya, this is important. Did you tell anyone else? No. I didn't know who to trust. I couldn't shake it. I assured her I'd handle it, that he had done the right thing by telling me. My mind raced, piecing together the implications. An unauthorized presence, someone intimately familiar with the lab's security protocols, capable of moving unseen. And Thorne, brilliant and reclusive, likely wouldn't have noticed or reported such a breach until it was too late. I needed to re-evaluate everything, starting with the initial scene. The body of Aris Thorne held secrets beyond the burns and the polymer. It held the silent testimony of a man who'd been under siege long before his final moments. And now, so was I. The colleague's trembling voice echoed in my head, a disquieting counterpoint to the hum of the server racks I now faced. An unauthorized presence. Someone intimately familiar. The words nodded me, reinforcing the unease that had settled deep in my gut from the moment I first stepped into the ruined lab. Thorne's death wasn't just an accident, it was a performance. And I was about to peel back the layers of its staging. I sat hunched over a portable forensics workstation, the lab's central server tower connected by a thick braid of cables. Its data stream was a torrent of information, environmental controls, security camera feeds, now mostly static from the explosion, equipment operational logs, network traffic. It was Thorne's digital ghost, every breath the lab took, every flicker of a light, every minute adjustment to the atmosphere, recorded. This was where the real story lay, buried beneath a mountain of routine data. My fingers flew across the keyboard, navigating through terabytes of raw information. I started with the environmental control system. Thorne's research, I knew, required extremely precise atmospheric conditions. Any deviation, however slight, could compromise an experiment. I filtered the logs for the hours leading up to the incident. Initial scans showed everything within parameters, a picture of perfect stability. Too perfect, perhaps. Then I broadened my search, cross-referencing the environmental data with the energy consumption logs of specific equipment. Thorne's bespoke atmospheric regulators, for instance, drew a consistent power load when operating normally. A fractional dip, then an immediate spike, then another dip. It wasn't a system malfunction, it was a stutter, like a system fighting against an external override, or perhaps, responding to a rapid, deliberate sequence of commands. I pictured Thorne, immersed in his work, oblivious to the digital strings being pulled around him. The superficial burns, the internal trauma consistent with rapid pressure changes, but none of the widespread charring one would expect from a purely accidental catastrophic explosion. It was the discrepancy that kept me digging. I zoomed in on the atmospheric composition readings. The log showed a sudden, sharp drop in oxygen levels, followed by an equally abrupt surge in a specific trace gas, one that, according to Thorne's own research notes, was highly reactive when exposed to a specific energy frequency. The timeline of this atmospheric shift perfectly coincided with the power fluctuations I'd already isolated. It wasn't random. It was engineered. I began reconstructing the sequence. First, the remote manipulation of the environmental controls, subtly altering the gas mixture, lowering the oxygen, and introducing the reactive trace gas. It wasn't a dump, it was a slow, insidious shift, designed to reach critical mass at a precise moment. This would have been almost impossible to detect from inside the lab without specialized monitoring, which Thorne, secure in his bespoke systems, likely wouldn't have been running for a routine experiment. Next, I turned to the equipment logs. The primary energy resonator, a device crucial to Thorne's work, showed an anomalous power surge at the exact moment the reactive gas reached its peak concentration. But it wasn't just a surge, it was a specific frequency output, one that Thorne rarely used, and never in conjunction with that particular gas mixture. This wasn't a malfunction, it was a deliberate activation, a weaponization of his own tools. The pieces clicked into place with a chilling finality. The initial atmospheric alteration created a volatile environment. The precise activation of the resonator at an uncharacteristic frequency acted as the trigger. The resulting reaction wasn't a simple explosion but a rapid, contained energy release, designed to mimic a catastrophic experimental failure. The unique burn pattern I'd observed, the localized destruction, the absence of widespread fire damage, it all pointed to this controlled, precise event. It was designed to look like Thorne pushed a boundary too far, that his genius had consumed him. The microscopic trace I'd found earlier, a residue from a cleaning agent, now made sense. Someone had to ensure there was no lingering evidence of that actual trigger mechanism. The perpetrator hadn't just understood Thorne's work, they had mastered it, twisting his protocols into a fatal trap. They knew the bespoke systems, the gas mixtures, the specific frequencies. This wasn't just an outsider with a grudge, this was an architect, someone with deep, intimate knowledge of Thorne's sanctuary. My determination hardened. That accident was a sophisticated act of murder, meticulously planned and executed. The killer had left a digital signature, faint but undeniable, etched into the very systems Thorne had built for his protection. The question of how was now answered. The more pressing, and far more dangerous, question of who loomed large. I closed the laptop, the screen reflecting my grim, resolute face. The game had just escalated. The hum of the server racks, the colleague's trembling voice, they still echoed, a phantom chorus in my head. An unauthorized presence. Someone intimately familiar. The words had been a cold ember, now fanned into a low, persistent burn, especially after what I'd found in the ruins of the lab. My unease had only deepened, a premonition solidifying into conviction. The room was sparse, clinical, a stark concrete box. The medical examiner, a gaunt individual with perpetually tired eyes, was reviewing a digital scan on a wall-mounted display, muttering to an assistant. I ignored their low conversation, my focus locked on the subtle contours beneath the sheet. The initial report had been a smokescreen, accidental explosion, a tragic miscalculation. It wasn't a random catastrophic failure. It was orchestrated. And the microscopic residue on the floor, the unusual burn patterns on the consoles, they were fingerprints of a deliberate, sophisticated attack, not an accident. If the killer had simply wanted Thorne's groundbreaking research, they could have just taken it. The lab's security was formidable, but not impenetrable to someone with intimate knowledge. This wasn't about acquiring Thorne's work, it was about preventing its completion, or perhaps, its public release. I pulled a small, ruggedized tablet from my satchel. On its screen, I brought up the partial data recovery from Thorne's personal terminal, salvaged from the fringes of the blast zone. Most of it was encrypted, a digital fortress even in its ruined state. But I'd found a single, uncorrupted log file, a personal journal, not part of his main research data. It was fragmented, riddled with code-locked entries, but the timestamps were clear. Thorne had been working on this after his primary research, almost as a separate, clandestine project. The medical examiner finally turned, his gaze passing over me. "Still here, Reed? We're almost done with the external." "Just reviewing some preliminary findings," I replied, not looking up. My fingers moved across the tablet's interface, a quiet dance of taps and swipes. I was looking for a pattern, a key, anything to unlock the layers Thorne had built around his thoughts. He wasn't just a brilliant scientist, he was a man who understood the value of secrets. One specific file, labeled ethics_review_alpha, caught my eye. It wasn't encrypted with the usual corporate-grade algorithms Thorne used for his main research. This one felt personal. A gut feeling, a forensic intuition honed over years, told me this was different. I remembered a peculiar sequence of keystrokes from a damaged keyboard in Thorne's private office, a sequence that didn't align with any standard password or system command. A hunch, nothing more, but it felt right. I typed the sequence into the tablet. The screen flickered, a progress bar crept agonizingly across the display, then vanished. The file opened. My breath hitched. The text unfurled, dense and precise, Thorne's voice in digital print. It wasn't about his core project. It was a separate, deeply unsettling narrative. He detailed his growing ethical concerns about the potential weaponization of his primary discoveries, not by external actors, but by Omnicorp itself. A project he believed was dangerously close to completion, designed to leverage the fundamental principles of his own research for an entirely destructive purpose. They aren't just interested in the energy yield, Thorne had written, his words stark on the screen. They want control. They are twisting my work, perverting its intent. I cannot allow this. I intend to expose Omnicorp's funding of Project Chimera. The implications are catastrophic. Project Chimera. My earlier hypothesis solidified into terrifying certainty. They wanted to prevent him from exposing the truth, from stopping Project Chimera. This wasn't just a murder, it was a preemptive strike, a desperate act to bury a truth that could shake the foundations of a global corporation and unleash something truly dangerous. Thorne had been a threat, not because of what he had, but because of what he knew, and what he intended to do. Thorne hadn't just been a victim of a lab accident. And I, by uncovering his secret, had just stepped into the very crosshairs that had claimed him. This investigation had just become far more perilous. Project Chimera. I stood over what remained of Aris Thorne, a sheet drawn up to his chin, obscuring the worst of the devastation. The faint scent of ozone and something acrid, almost metallic, clung to the air, a phantom reminder of the lab's final moments. My earlier hypothesis had solidified into terrifying certainty. The killer hadn't wanted Thorne's research, they wanted to silence him. They wanted to prevent him from completing Chimera. If Thorne was on the cusp of something world-changing, something with such profound implications that someone was willing to orchestrate a meticulously disguised murder, then the stakes were far higher than a simple corporate espionage case. This wasn't about theft, it was about absolute prevention. I pulled my encrypted tablet from my satchel, its screen a cool glow in the dim light. My fingers, still faintly smelling of disinfectant, moved across the display, calling up the secured network connection to Omnicorp's internal servers. Thorne's silent presence felt less like an accusation and more like a challenge, pushing me to see what he couldn't, to finish what he'd started, or at least, to uncover why it had been stopped. My first filter was access. The lab's security logs were a labyrinth of entries, biometric scans, and timestamps. I cross-referenced these with the specific time window of the incident, then narrowed it further to individuals with Level 5 clearance, the highest tier, required for independent access to Thorne's secure research wing. This immediately pruned the list from hundreds to a mere 17. 17 individuals who could have walked in, untouched, during the critical period. Next, I layered in expertise. The sabotage wasn't crude. It wasn't a bomb or a simple power surge. It required a deep understanding of not just bioengineering protocols, but also the lab-specific failsafes and, crucially, how to override them without leaving digital fingerprints. I sifted through the 17 profiles, looking for specialized training in systems architecture, advanced robotics, or, more tellingly, previous work with experimental containment fields. Most were pure scientists, brilliant in their fields, but lacking the specific blend of technical and operational know-how needed for such a sophisticated act. One profile, in particular, kept snagging my attention, not for what it immediately revealed, but for what it seemed to omit. The Omnicorp liaison, a man referred to only as David Thorne, no relation to the deceased, according to corporate records, was listed as having an administrative and oversight role. Bland, efficient, unremarkable. Too unremarkable, perhaps. I drilled down into his employment history, bypassing the summary provided by Omnicorp's public-facing HR system. My access allowed a deeper dive into archived records, older security clearances, and less sanitized personnel files. The standard corporate ladder he supposedly climbed seemed to have a few missing rungs, or perhaps a few hidden trapdoors. His early career, predating his Omnicorp tenure by a decade, was a patchwork of short-term contracts with various security consulting firms and logistics management groups. The names themselves were generic, almost deliberately so. The details buried within them were anything but. Special Projects Coordinator at a firm known for its high-stakes asset recovery. Risk Assessment Specialist for an organization that handled sensitive international transfers. These weren't the roles of a paper-pushing liaison. These were the hallmarks of someone with a background in covert operations, skilled in infiltration, exfiltration, and information denial. This wasn't just a corporate operative, he was a trained one. David Thorne's background provided the how. Now, I needed the why. I pushed deeper into the liaison's digital footprint, searching for anything beyond the professional facade. An obscure legal filing from years ago, sealed and almost completely redacted, but enough remained to piece together the outline. A class action lawsuit, settled out of court, involving a major pharmaceutical firm and allegations of industrial espionage. Stolen intellectual property, specifically a groundbreaking vaccine formula. The lead defendant? And listed as a key witness, whose testimony was curiously never fully disclosed, was David Thorne himself. The connection solidified. A past scandal involving stolen intellectual property. A man with a background in covert operations, now embedded as a liaison to a bioengineer working on something called Project Chimera. The motive crystallized, sharp and clear. This wasn't about stealing Thorne's research, not directly. It was about controlling it, preventing its independent release, or perhaps, selling it to the highest bidder without Thorne's consent or even knowledge. My breath plumed in the frigid air. The temperature in the room felt irrelevant now. David Thorne. He wasn't just a suspect, he was the inside man. And he was very, very good at hiding his tracks. Project Chimera. My mind, however, wasn't on the man beneath the sheet, but on the implications of that name, and the unique polymer I'd found, a signature both insidious and revealing. I'd spent the last 24 hours in a blur of analysis, cross-referencing every scrap of data. The polymer, a complex, high-tensile material, was unlike anything commercially available. Its molecular structure hinted at a bespoke synthesis, designed for extreme durability and specific reactive properties. It was the same material found at the sites of the two accidents that had plagued Thorne's research team over the past year, a ruptured pressure vessel, a faulty environmental seal. Now, it was here, in minute traces, clinging to the scorched edges of Thorne's lab equipment, subtly altering the burn patterns. It wasn't just a material, it was a signature, a calling card. My theory solidified. This wasn't a random act, nor was it suicide. This was a targeted elimination, meticulously disguised, but why? And who would go to such lengths? Only someone with intimate knowledge of Thorne's work, his lab, and the very specific vulnerabilities of his projects. Someone who understood the unique properties of this polymer. It was time to set a trap. A delicate piece of bait, designed to lure a very specific predator. The next morning, I initiated the controlled leak. I drafted a preliminary report, carefully crafting the language to suggest a significant breakthrough in the analysis of Thorne's final project, specifically mentioning a newly identified stabilizing agent that had previously been overlooked. I described its unique spectral signature, implying it was the key to understanding the true nature of Project Chimera. The crucial detail was that this agent was, in fact, the trace polymer I'd identified. Only the killer, knowing its true purpose, not as a stabilizing agent but as a destructive accelerant, would understand the catastrophic implications of its discovery and feel compelled to act. I left the report open on my desk, positioned strategically under a low-light camera I'd installed. I then made a point of leaving my unit for a simulated consultation, ensuring I was seen exiting the building. I watched from a discreet observation point across the street, the building's security feed patched directly to my tablet. The wait was agonizing. Minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. My jaw ached from clenching. Had I miscalculated? Was the bait too subtle or too obvious? Just as I considered aborting the operation, a figure appeared on the feed. It was David Thorne, Aris's brother, looking agitated, his eyes darting around the empty corridor. He moved with a forced casualness that screamed guilt. He bypassed the main entry system, using a keycard I hadn't seen before, one that granted him access to secured areas far beyond what his administrative role should permit. My gut tightened. He slipped into my unit, his silhouette stark against the glow of my monitor. He went straight for my desk. His fingers, surprisingly nimble, swept over the keyboard, attempting to access the system. He wasn't just trying to read, he was trying to erase. He meant to obliterate the very evidence I'd fabricated. "Caught you," I murmured into my comms, signaling the surveillance team to move in. I was back in my unit before he had a chance to complete the wipe. The door hissed open, and I stepped inside, the sudden light startling him. He froze, the data wipe still clutched in his hand, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning horror. "David," I said, my voice calm, but with an edge I couldn't quite suppress. "Lost something?" He stammered, his face paling. "Reed. What are you?" "I just, came to see if you needed anything. Thought I saw your light on." He gestured vaguely at the empty room. "Really?" I walked to my desk, picking up the report he'd tried to erase. "Because it looks like you were more interested in this." I held up the document. My preliminary findings on the stabilizing agent in Project Chimera. His eyes flickered to the data wipe in his hand. Then back to me. He swallowed hard. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" I leaned against the desk, my gaze unwavering. "This stabilizing agent is a unique polymer, David. One I've found at 3 separate incident sites. The ruptured pressure vessel, the faulty environmental seal, and now, Aris's lab. It doesn't stabilize anything. It accelerates degradation." Inside, a microscopic fragment of the polymer glinted under the light. "We found this on the sole of your shoe, David. A perfect match for the material in Aris's lab. And the same material we found at that accidents involving his prior research. It's a custom synthesis. Not something you'd pick up walking down the street." He stared at the bag, then at his own shoes, as if seeing them for the first time. The fight visibly drained from him. His shoulders slumped, and he let out a ragged breath. Not the whole corporation, but a faction. He found out about Project Chimera. It wasn't just bioengineering research. It was bioweapon development. He was going to expose them. He threatened to go public with everything. Their unethical trials, the modifications, the sheer destructive potential. He was naive enough to think he could just walk away, blow the whistle. His gaze met mine, filled with a desperate, pathetic plea for understanding. They knew I was struggling. My own projects were failing. They offered me a way out, a chance to secure my future. They said Aris was a liability, a danger to the company's vision. They gave me the polymer, told me how to use it, how to make it untraceable. I wanted to save my career. I didn't mean for him to die, not really. Just to stop him. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with the weight of his confession. The truth, ugly and raw, hung between us. It wasn't about a breakthrough. The pieces clicked into place, forming a grim, complete picture. Aris Thorne wasn't a victim of science gone wrong, he was a casualty of human greed. The air in the room, still thick with the residue of David Thorne's confession, felt heavier than any chemical spill. The silence that followed his broken words was a vacuum, sucking the oxygen from my lungs. He stood there, shoulders slumped, the weight of his actions finally crushing him. I didn't need to speak. The truth, ugly and raw, had done its work. Uniformed officers moved in quickly, their movements precise, professional. They cuffed him, reading him his rights in a low, steady monotone that seemed almost reverent in its detachment. David Thorne offered no resistance, no further pleas. His eyes, when they briefly met mine, held a strange mixture of defeat and, perhaps, a sliver of relief. The charade was over. I watched him go, then turned my attention back to the empty space where his brother, Dr. Aris Thorne, had once stood, brilliant and oblivious to the betrayal brewing so close. The laboratory, once a symbol of intellectual triumph, now felt like a mausoleum. Each piece of equipment, each burnished surface, whispered of ambition and its deadly cost. The fallout was immediate, a seismic event that shook the foundations of Omnicorp. My initial report, detailing David Thorne's complicity and the systemic cover-up, hit the highest levels like a wrecking ball. The first wave of arrests came swiftly, a senior research director, then 2 more executives involved in what was termed Project Oversight. The public statements from Omnicorp were carefully worded, full of shock and promises of full cooperation, but the damage was done. The media, a hungry beast awakened, tore into the story with rabid glee. Every news channel, every online portal, screamed headlines of corporate malfeasance and scientific hubris. Hours later, the adrenaline that had fueled me through the confession and the subsequent paperwork began to ebb. The facility was quiet, hushed, the fluorescent lights humming with a sterile indifference. Dr. Thorne's body lay on a stainless steel table, covered by a sheet. A colleague, the lead forensic pathologist, was making notes nearby, her expression somber. He looked up as I entered. "Read," he acknowledged, his voice a low murmur. "Just finishing up the final report. Cause of death remains consistent, but the circumstances. There's something else." I nodded, approaching the table. She pulled back the sheet, revealing the quiet, still form of the brilliant bioengineer. His face, no longer contorted by the agony of his final moments, held a serene, almost peaceful quality now. But the subtle burn patterns, the precise, almost surgical nature of the injuries I'd first observed, still spoke volumes. They weren't accidental. The precision. It still feels too complex for a panicked, desperate act. The pathologist hummed, flipping a page in her notebook. That's because it wasn't just a panicked act. Not entirely. We found trace residues of a specific accelerant in the burn areas, one that would have significantly intensified the initial reaction, making it far more destructive than Thorne's own research would have naturally produced in that time frame. Reveal/discovery, my breath hitched. An accelerant? So, it wasn't just about triggering the reaction and escaping. It was about erasing the reaction, making sure nothing survived, including Dr. Thorne. Exactly, she confirmed, her eyes meeting mine. It was a scorched earth protocol. He was told to ensure nothing salvageable remained. That was the missing piece. The depth of the conspiracy wasn't just about covering up a single death, but about controlling the very legacy of Dr. Thorne's work. The accelerant meant a premeditated, calculated strategy to ensure the total destruction of the research data contained within Dr. Thorne's own body, which he had, in his final, desperate act, used as a secure vault. David Thorne wasn't just a murderer, he was an executioner, fulfilling a directive to ensure absolute deniability. The ethical debate surrounding scientific advancement and corporate responsibility exploded across every platform. How far was too far? Who owned the rights to potentially world-changing, or world-ending, discoveries? Governments and international organizations, initially silent, began to issue carefully worded statements, then more forceful demands. They weren't just interested in justice, they were interested in control. Thorne's research, whatever fragments of it survived, represented a power vacuum, a technological prize too valuable to ignore. The next morning, a joint press conference was held, broadcast live globally. The Attorney General, flanked by agency heads, announced the formal charges against David Thorne and the expanding list of Omnicorp executives. The public's shock was palpable. The faces of the executives, once symbols of corporate power, now flashed across screens, stripped of their prestige, their reputations in tatters. I watched the broadcast from my desk, the muted voices a distant hum. The case was technically closed, the immediate perpetrator apprehended. But the true aftermath, the wider implications of Aris Thorne's genius and its fatal exploitation, had only just begun. The future of his research, fragments salvaged from the digital wreckage, now hung precariously, a dangerous, coveted prize in a world suddenly awakened to its terrifying potential. The tension wasn't over, it had merely transformed, shifting from the quiet hunt for a killer to a global scramble for power. And I, Reed, had merely opened the door. The fluorescent lights hummed with a low, unwavering drone, casting long, stark shadows across the stainless steel surfaces. I stood by the gurney, not looking at the sheeted form, but at the empty space above it, visualizing the invisible threads of consequence that had led us here. The final report lay heavy in my hand, its crisp pages a testament to the meticulous unraveling of a meticulously crafted lie. The accelerant, initially a phantom whisper in the data, had become a roaring declaration. It wasn't a tragic accident, nor a desperate act of self-annihilation. It was a calculated obliteration, designed not just to extinguish a life, but to seize control of a legacy. The corporate executive, whose polished demeanor had barely concealed an avaricious hunger, had been identified. The motive, as old as ambition itself, had been laid bare, the desperate desire to possess Thorne's groundbreaking work, to steer its potentially world-changing trajectory for personal gain, even if it meant extinguishing its brilliant creator. I thought back to the burn patterns, the microscopic traces, the unusual density of the residue. Each detail, a single, almost imperceptible brushstroke, had painted a picture of deliberate intent, a narrative far more sinister than any initial assessment. The true horror wasn't just the act of murder, but the profound violation of scientific ethics, the cynical exploitation of knowledge meant for progress. Thorne's research, designed to push the boundaries of human understanding, had instead become a weapon, a prize in a ruthless game. It was a stark reminder that innovation, unchecked by conscience, could be as destructive as it was transformative. Each case chipped away at some naive corner of my optimism, revealing another layer of human depravity, another testament to what individuals would sacrifice for power or profit. There were nights, many of them, when the images replayed behind my eyelids, the shattered glass, the charred remains, the silent, accusing evidence. The constant vigilance, the need to see what others missed, to question every assumption, took its toll. My own reflections, grim and tired, stared back at me from the polished chrome, a phantom image superimposed on the memory of the lab's destruction. But then, there was the counterweight, the surge of purpose, the quiet satisfaction of clarity emerging from chaos. Someone had to speak for the silent, interpret the language of their demise. That commitment, forged in the crucible of countless investigations, burned steadily within me. It wasn't just about justice for Thorne, it was about upholding the very integrity of discovery, about ensuring that the pursuit of knowledge remained a beacon, not a dangerous tool in the hands of the unscrupulous. The legal proceedings would be lengthy, complex, a drawn-out battle in the courtrooms, but the forensic truth was undeniable. The evidence, painstakingly collected and meticulously analyzed, would speak volumes, echoing the final moments of Dr. Thorne's brilliant, tragically cut-short life. There was a sense of finality to it, a closing of this particular chapter. Thorne's legacy, though tarnished by the circumstances of his death, would ultimately be defined by the profound implications of his work, now safeguarded from those who sought to corrupt it. It wasn't a battle that ended with a single arrest or a single case closed. My gaze drifted to the small, stuffed briefcase I carried, a constant companion. Inside, tucked beneath the completed Thorne file, was a new dossier, thinner, less urgent, but already demanding attention. A series of unexplained failures at a remote agricultural research facility, a string of unfortunate coincidences that had piqued the curiosity of a colleague. The details were sparse, the implications vague, but a familiar flicker ignited within me. The world, it seemed, was never short of mysteries, never short of those who sought to bend its rules, and never short of the silent stories waiting to be unearthed.